Man is neither angel nor beast, and the tragedy is that whoever strives to act like an angel ends up acting like a beast. This is a famous quote by the French philosopher Blaise Pascal. He thought that we are miserable creatures because we are capable of imagining eternity and justice, but at the same time we are beasts driven by hunger and lust. This idea is perfectly incarnated in one of the most emblematic figures in Dostoevsky's universe, Raskolnikov, a man who thought to become a god by trying to rise above humanity. In this video, we are going to discover the fall of this man by analyzing one of the most influential novels of literature, Crime and Punishment. Raskolnikov's problem is the problem of total freedom. A poor, proud student, squeezed between hunger and humiliation, tries to think his way out of misery. And in his feverish calculations, he asks himself a question that honestly should never be asked by anyone with a pulse. What is the life of a malicious, useless pawnbroker worth compared to mine? If he kills her, if he takes her money, he can save his mother and sister, pay for his studies, become a respectable member of the society, and why not, do some good along the way. He says, for one single life, thousands of other lives saved. What importance does that evil witch have in balance of life? It's horrifying, it's logical. It's exactly that kind of idea that ruins your life the moment you take it seriously. He returns home like a man condemned to death. He no longer reasons. He cannot reason. The whole crime seems mysteriously predestined. Events arrange themselves with a disturbing smoothness, as if the hem of his coat had been caught in the gears of a machine. One tug and he's inside. And so what happens? He kills, he steals, no one suspects him. And that's when the real punishment begins. He doesn't even open the purse. He doesn't even know what he stole. He doesn't care. And slowly, painfully, he discovers the truth he didn't want to know. I did not kill to help my mother. I killed for myself alone. I wanted to know whether I was a worm like others or a man, whether I dared to take power or not, whether I had the right. Raskolnikov is suffocating in the polite, timid world of ordinary morality. He wants to escape the herd, to test whether he is called to a superior destiny. So if some man, like Napoleon for example, could slaughter cities, abandon armies, burn through 500,000 lives and still end up with status, then surely everything is permitted, or at least to someone. And perhaps Raskolnikov says to himself, everything is permitted to me as well. The old woman is not a person in his eyes. She's more like a principle, a wall he must break through to reach absolute freedom. If he can overcome this obstacle, then he will know. He's a superman, a creature of new laws, a man to whom punishment no longer applies. If he can kill her and remain free, then he's free in every sense. But of course, Dostoevsky gives him the one freedom he did not anticipate. The freedom to destroy himself from the very inside. Raskolnikov has never been less free than after he stepped outside the moral law. The moment he claims absolute freedom, a new trap grips him. A fixed idea eats away at his mind. Day and night, the crime that was supposed to make him a king persecutes him instead. He is trapped in a restless internal dialogue. He splits in two. He becomes his own accuser and his own defender. And over both, he is also his own judge. He is no longer just a person. He is now incarnating a tribunal. Through Raskolnikov's struggle, Dostoevsky is trying to share something very important. A murder cannot be justified to the deep conscience. Whoever attacks another human being attacks God as well, and most importantly, the divine spark within himself. When Raskolnikov struck the old pawnbroker, he didn't just destroy a greedy hag, he destroyed himself, or rather, the purest part of his soul. After all, I only killed the parasite, says Raskolnikov, a dirty, useless, harmful parasite. That parasite was a human being, Sonia answers quietly. Every human life outweighs the abstraction of a single mind. No idea, however noble, however urgent, deserves the death of a man. It doesn't matter if you are an evil pawnbroker or a humble prostitute like Sonia, everyone is made in the image of God. All are loved equally. And so once he crosses that line, Raskolnikov fails immediately. He's not comfortable in this vast land of supposed freedom. The strength that carried him there abandons him. The future Superman trembles like a child in the dark room. And so he is far from everyone, a stranger to others and to himself. Those around him take him for a madman. He flees from them and draws closer to the unfortunate. He loves them, but even they cannot be his true companions. His crime isolates him at the very center of humanity. It confines him to himself. Only a total confession, only a punishment freely embraced could return him to the human world. So Raskolnikov enters a paradoxical loop. On one side he fears discovery and judgment, but on the other he cannot stay away from the police. He circles the investigator Porfiry like a moth to a flame, terrified and attracted at the same time. And the investigator, who has long suspected him, plays with him, reassures him, terrifies him again with a demoniac calm. Don't worry, you will come back. You cannot do without us. I'm convinced you will reach the point where you want to accept suffering. The test of absolute freedom proves too hard for Raskolnikov. After 1,000 inner battles, the failed Superman collapses at the feet of Sonia, the prostitute who feels pity for him. He confesses his crime, and she gives him the simplest yet hardest command. So you want me to go to the penal colony, Sonia? What you must do is accept suffering and be redeemed through it. And so Raskolnikov obeys. He goes to a crossroads, kneels in the dust, and kisses the earth he has defiled. Then he walks to the police station and says, slowly, healthily but clearly, "It was I who killed the old pawnbroker and her sister Lizaveta with an axe and robbed them." He is sentenced to hard labor, and Sonia follows him into the Siberian wilderness. Yet even now he asks himself, how is that my act seems so odious to them? Dostoevsky here insists Raskolnikov does not yet repent. Why is it a crime? What does the word crime even mean? My conscience is quiet. I killed. So what? If the law demands a head, take mine and be done with it. He still thinks of the benefactors of humanity, like Napoleon, for example, who became great only because they refused to turn back. What condemns him, he tells himself, is not the murder, but the weakness. His physical nature gave in, and the Superman cracked. In his mind, his real fault was going to confess. And yet, paradoxically, out of this lie, out of these last doubts, faith suddenly erupts. It does not happen gradually. It does not follow logic. It happens all at once, like a spark igniting a pile of dry straw. Sonia had once read him the story of the Lazarus from the Gospel. I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me shall never die. He hadn't understood it then. Only now, only here on the Siberian ground, does the word resurrection finally take root. And here we touch what I believe is the most beautiful moment of the novel. How did it happen? Even Raskolnikov doesn't know. But suddenly something seizes him, pushes him to Sonia's feet. They try to speak but cannot. Their eyes fill with tears. They are pale, exhausted, worn to the bone. And yet, on their consumed faces, something dawns. What is it? The faint light of a new beginning, the first glimmer of an entire resurrection to life. And Dostoevsky writes, they did not know that the new life would not be given for nothing, that it would have to be paid for dearly, purchased with a great future deed. But that is the beginning of a new story. For now, they were happy. 7 years remained. Only 7 years. At the beginning of their happiness, they were ready to look upon those 7 years as though they were 7 days. Through Sonia, the little prostitute who stands taller than any philosopher, Raskolnikov finally discovers what freedom actually is. Not that proud, icy freedom he once worshipped, not the freedom of the self-made God, but the freedom grounded in something outside him, because man is not God, and every attempt to become God ends up in the same way, in collapse. According to Dostoevsky, to deny God is ultimately to deny oneself. To want to be God is to dissolve into the universe, to be everything and nothing at once. There are, as Dostoevsky suggests, 2 kinds of freedom. The first is the ordinary freedom, the kind that lives within the walls. Here you choose good because you are afraid of punishment. You follow the rules because the law threatens you, or I don't know, because you fear hell. It isn't glorious, but it keeps the world running. But this timid freedom disgusts certain proud spirits. They step beyond the wall into the second, final freedom. Here, a man doesn't do good just because he was taught to. He acts according to his own will, pure, unfiltered, and terrifying. Some, believing themselves Supermen, break on their first attempt. Others discover something unexpected, the quiet sweetness of doing good just because it is good. This unforced goodness, goodness chosen freely, draws them step by step back toward God. Raskolnikov reaches this peace only by passing through crime. He sinned out of pride. He misused the freedom he had been given. He struck at another person thinking he was striking at a principle. But the instinct for good, the one he believed would die first, survived the fall. And this stubborn instinct tormented him, humbled him, and ultimately saved him. And so repentance redeems the fault. Humility purchases freedom. In this rediscovered smallness, Raskolnikov understands himself, understands God, and understands the world, and in his place within it. He finds his life where he expected only ruin. Dostoevsky's conclusion returns, quietly and inevitably, to the words of the Gospel. He who preserves his life shall lose it, and he who loses his life for my sake shall find it. Around the figure of Raskolnikov, the burning center of the novel, move other fallen souls, each circling the same moral abyss, each seeking the same impossible forgiveness. Of course their sins differ, but the trajectory is kind of the same: transgression, humiliation, and the faint hope of grace. It is, for example, in the filthy tavern that Raskolnikov meets Marmeladov, Sonia's father, and a man who has collapsed so completely that he almost enjoys measuring his own fall. He is a coward, a drunk, a beatic talker with nothing left to pawn but his dignity. He has even let his daughter sell herself because he can no longer earn a coin. And yet, in this ruin, he clings to a single, trembling faith. He will have pity on us. He who has understood everything. He will judge the wise first, and when he has finished, he will say, "Come forth, you too, you drunkards, you weak ones, come without shame." And the wise will protest, "Lord, how can you receive them?" And he will answer, "Because not one of them believed himself worthy." As you can see, for Dostoevsky, humility is already a kind of redemption, and Sonia, the little sinner radiant with compassion, embodies it more fully than anyone else. She is indeed the one that tells Raskolnikov that their roads are the same. Both indeed have broken the moral law. Both have crossed the line. Both will have to work through darkness. But here their difference becomes clear. While Raskolnikov draws a terrible pride from having pushed beyond human limits, Sonia, on the contrary, recognizes her fall and accepts it as a wound she must carry. She clings sincerely to the one man who has not despised her. She feels for him what Dostoevsky calls insatiable compassion. And faced with this purity, nested inside sin, Raskolnikov bows. "I did not bow down before you, but before all human suffering." She is the one to whom he confesses the murder, and she responds, "What have you done against yourself? No one in the world is more unhappy than you." And later she will follow him to Siberia, like a small, stubborn angel, watching for the first signs of his resurrection. Sonia is one of Dostoevsky's most delicate creatures, a transparent sinner whose earthly condemnation becomes the very sign of her spiritual innocence. Her humility and sweetness hurt the reader. She seems to carry the guilt of all mankind. She saves others by losing herself. But even here, Dostoevsky whispers, "Those who believe themselves lost never truly are. Because all are guilty, or rather, because guilt is universal, forgiveness must be too." Besides Sonia stands another very important character, Dunya, Raskolnikov's sister, gentle and resolute, who also knows her share of radiant sin. She is ready to sacrifice herself to the cold, calculating Luzhin to save her brother. Raskolnikov understands the price she intends to pay and cries out, "This marriage is an ignominy. I may be ignoble, but I do not want you to be." Another great sinner in this constellation is Svidrigailov, a man without fear, without faith, without even disgust. A man who believes the afterlife is nothing but a little smoky room with spiderwebs in the corners. He lives by sensation only, nothing restrains him, not pity, not responsibility, not memory. He has committed unspeakable acts, and he recounts them with the casualness of a man describing a stroll. He pursues Dunya to Petersburg, traps her in a room, and offers to save her brother only if she gives herself to him. She fires a revolver as response, and missing throws it aside in horror. And Svidrigailov, seeing that she does not love him enough to kill him, lets her go. This refusal, this dignity breaks him. The man who felt nothing suddenly feels too much. And so he spends the night wandering taverns. He gives Sonia money, he frees his young fiancée with a fortune, he rents a filthy hotel and tries to sleep. But nightmares tear him apart. He sees the girl who hanged herself because of him. He sees a child turning toward him with a burning face. He wakes in terror. By morning, disgust has consumed him. He walks into the street and ends his life. And so this tragic gallery, Marmeladov, Sonia, Dunya, Svidrigailov, Luzin, all these sinners and cynics who circle Raskolnikov, show the same truth. Each carries his own forgiveness within him. They all know their decadence. And for Dostoevsky, only the judges deserve judgment. Only the cold intellect and dry heart, the man who feels nothing, only he is truly vile. So, no crime abolishes the right to forgiveness. Love rescues everything. Love is humility. And human love, to be real, must bow its head. Dostoevsky is often been accused of writing only about monsters and invalids. Dr. Chi, one of his great specialists, even calculated that a quarter of his characters are clinical cases. We have 6 in Crime and Punishment, 2 in The Brothers Karamazov, 6 in The Demons, 4 in The Idiot and 4 in The Adolescent. And if you think about it and consider the characters of his novels, we see a world of madness. At first glance, we have nothing in common with these unsettling beings. And yet we feel irresistibly drawn to them, as one is drawn to the edge of an abyss. We've never met people like them, and yet they feel strangely familiar. We understand them, we love them, we recognize ourselves in them. Because they are not more abnormal than we are, they are simply what we do not dare to be. They say out loud what we bury in the basement of our conscience. They expose under the sun what we lock in ourselves. But what about their illness, their madness? Well, those are only excuses. The thing is that Dostoevsky had to dress his characters in fevers, seizures, illness, and breakdowns simply to make them plausible. To make the reader accept the violence of their thoughts, the nakedness of their logic, he had to slap a medical label on them. He overloaded them to unload us. These characters, these embodied ideas, are credible because they are unbalanced. The author warns us, what I show you is plausible, see? The people are sick. And of course the critics take the bait. They read Dostoevsky like a psychiatric manual. They never think to lift the mask, to look at the true faces of these so-called monsters. Their human faces, which is also our faces. We could ask ourselves, like many critics do, does literature have the right to concern itself with morbid exceptions? But where's the exception? Who is sick here? To be sick, one must have a body. Dostoevsky's creatures barely have one. They are not bodies at all. They are more like vehicles of our own thoughts. They are nothing but our thoughts dramatized. And what about the world they inhabit? It resembles ours only because of the author's stagecraft. Those icy attics, striking taverns, and grimy laundry hanging in the windows do not form a realistic city. They form more like a dreamscape or a nightmare. Even the precise little details feels like symbol from a fever. Consider these examples. The picture of the German ladies in the pawnbroker's flat, the dried watermelon and blackened biscuits in the tavern, the ugly, muddy dog with its tail between its legs passing Svidrigailov just before he kills himself. Each of these details gives us like a small electric shock, but it doesn't wake us up. They exist only to remind us, out of charity, how far we've traveled from reality. And then the shock fades, and we slip back into our dream walk, following these feverish figures. They look nothing like us, except that, deep down, they are exactly who we are. Thank you for watching this video. I'm Ivan and this is Empyreon, the Academy of Philosophy and Fine Arts.